Imagine yourself standing in the Dordogne region of what is now modern-day France, roughly 17,000 years ago. It is the height of the last glacial maximum, and the air is so cold it feels like it's shattering against your skin. You are huddled deep within the limestone throat of a cave, perhaps the one we now call Lascaux. Outside, the world is a brutal theater of survival where mammoths roam and a single twisted ankle is a death sentence. You are hungry, your tribe is exhausted, and the sun has been gone for hours. By every metric of evolutionary logic, you should be sleeping to conserve calories or sharpening a flint spearhead for tomorrow's hunt. Instead, you are standing on a rickety wooden scaffold, holding a hollowed-out stone filled with animal fat and a wick of moss. By this flickering, smoky light, you are using a mixture of iron oxide and charcoal to paint a massive, charging bull on the ceiling, not because it helps you eat, but because you want to tell a story. This is the central paradox of our species. Why, when the stakes of survival were so high, did ancient humans waste precious time, energy, and resources on things that didn't keep them alive? For decades, we've been told a specific story about our ancestors. It's the nasty, brutish, and short myth. The idea that prehistoric life was a non-stop, 24-hour grind of fleeing predators and foraging for scraps. In this version of history, fun is a modern luxury, something we invented only after we conquered the food chain and built air conditioning. But the archaeology tells a completely different story, one that suggests our ancestors weren't just surviving, they were arguably better at enjoying themselves than we are today. When we look at the physical evidence left behind, we see a species that was obsessed with games, obsessed with rhythm, and seemingly desperate to find ways to laugh in the face of extinction. If life was truly just a desperate struggle to exist, why did a hunter-gatherer 40,000 years ago spend weeks carefully carving a flute out of a vulture's wing bone? Why would they risk their lives to play a ball game where the loser might be sacrificed to the gods? But if the struggle narrative is wrong, what does that say about the very foundation of human nature? We often assume that progress is a linear climb from misery to comfort, but the original affluent society theory, proposed by anthropologist Marshall Sahlins in the late 1960s, dismantled this assumption. Sahlins pointed out that hunter-gatherer societies often worked only 15 to 20 hours a week to meet all their material needs. The rest of the time wasn't spent staring blankly at the cave wall. It was spent in what we would now call leisure. The myth of the overworked caveman is just that, a myth. In reality, the ancient world was a place of immense boredom, and boredom is the mother of all invention. This leads us to our first real loop of investigation, the birth of the game. Before we had written language, we had dice. In the Skara Brae settlement in Scotland, which dates back to 3100 BC, archaeologists found small, polished stone dice. These weren't for divination or religious rituals, they were for gambling. Humans have been trying to beat the odds for as long as we've been able to count. Could the thrill of the gamble actually be a calibrated survival reflex? When we look at the oldest known board games, like Senet in Egypt or the royal game of Uar in Mesopotamia, we see something more than just a pastime. Senet, which appeared around 3100 BCE, was so popular that it was played by everyone from the lowest peasants to the pharaoh Tutankhamun himself. The game board consisted of 30 squares, and the goal was to navigate your pieces through a series of hazards to the end. But over centuries, the game shifted from a simple race into a religious allegory. The squares became representing the journey of the soul through the Duat, or the Egyptian underworld. For an ancient Egyptian, fun wasn't a distraction from the serious business of life, it was a rehearsal for the serious business of death. You weren't just playing a game, you were practicing your own salvation. This connection between play and the profound is a recurring theme. The royal game of Uar, rediscovered by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, was so addictive that it spread across the entire Near East, remaining popular for nearly 3,000 years before it vanished. It took a British museum curator named Irving Finkel, who decoded a clay tablet from 177 BCE, to finally remind us how to play it. But if games were a rehearsal for the soul, what were the high-stakes physical competitions a rehearsal for? This brings us to the most dangerous form of ancient fun, the Mesoamerican ball game, known as pits or ulama. Played by the Olmecs, Mayans, and Aztecs for over 3 millennia, this wasn't just a sport, it was a cosmic battle. Players used their hips to knock a solid rubber ball, which could weigh up to 9 pounds, through stone hoops mounted high on the walls. Because the ball was so heavy and the rules forbade using hands or feet, the players suffered horrific internal injuries. Bruising was so severe that some accounts suggest players had to have their hematomas surgically lanced after matches. And yet, the stadiums built for this game were the architectural focal points of their cities. The stakes weren't just physical, they were existential. In some ritual versions of the game, the movement of the ball represented the movement of the sun, and the outcome of the game decided who would be offered to the gods to ensure the world didn't end. This is a level of fan engagement that makes modern sports riots look like a polite disagreement. Was the adrenaline of the game worth the literal price of blood? In the ancient Mediterranean, the Greeks took a different approach to physical fun, but one no less extreme. The Olympic Games, starting in 776 BCE, were held in honor of Zeus. We tend to imagine the ancient Olympics as a proto-version of our modern games, but they were far grittier. There were no silver or bronze medals. There was only the winner, who received an olive wreath and eternal glory, and the losers, who returned home in shame. Events like the Pancration were essentially no-holds-barred fighting matches where the only rules were no eye gouging and no biting. Men fought until one surrendered or died. The famous boxer Eurytion of Phegalia actually won his final Olympic bout while he was being strangled to death. He managed to break his opponent's toe, forcing a forfeit just as his own heart stopped. The Greeks believed that agon, or the spirit of competition, was the only way to achieve a rate, or excellence. Fun was a forge, and the body was the iron. But did this obsession with physical perfection leave any room for the simple pleasure of a quiet night? While the athletes were bruising their ribs in Olympia, others were seeking a different kind of release. This leads us to the beer before bread hypothesis. For a long time, historians assumed humans settled down and started farming grains so they wouldn't have to wander for food. But researchers like Brian Hayden and archaeologists at the site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey have suggested a more fun alternative. They found evidence of massive stone vats that could hold up to 160 liters of liquid, with chemical traces of calcium oxalate, a byproduct of brewing beer. This suggests that humans may have invented agriculture specifically so they could produce enough grain to get drunk together. Göbekli Tepe, which is 11,000 years old, predates permanent housing and organized farming. It seems that before we built cities, we built a place to throw a party. Feasting was the social glue that held disparate tribes together, turning potential enemies into drinking buddies. If we built civilization just to have a drink, what does that say about our priorities? The Sumerians even had a goddess of beer, Ninkasi. The hymn to Ninkasi, inscribed on a clay tablet from 1800 BCE, is both a prayer and a literal recipe for brewing. They drank their beer through long, communal reeds to filter out the floating bits of bread used in the fermentation process. In ancient Mesopotamia, the tavern was the center of social life, a place where people gathered to gossip, tell jokes, and forget the crushing weight of the Bronze Age tax collector. In ancient Greece, this evolved into the symposium, a structured drinking party where the wine was always diluted with water. The goal wasn't to get blackout drunk, that was considered barbaric, but to reach a state of divine mania, where the mind opened up to philosophy, poetry, and song. They even had a game called Katabos, where you'd flick the dregs of your wine at a target across the room. It was essentially the 500 BCE version of beer pong. But was the wine just a lubricant for a deeper human need? That need was storytelling. Long before the first word was ever scratched into a tablet, humans were the storytelling animal. We see this in the cave of Lascaux, where researchers have noted that the animals are often painted in sequences, a horse with multiple legs, or a bison in different stages of a gallop. When you move a torch past these images in the dark, the flickering light creates the illusion of movement. It is, quite literally, the world's first cinema. These caves weren't just galleries, they were theaters. We can imagine a shaman standing in the center of that cave, the smell of burnt fat in the air, using the shadows to bring the hunt to life for a group of wide-eyed children. This wasn't just fun, it was a data transfer. Stories were how we remembered where the water was, which berries were poisonous, and who our ancestors were. Did the thrill of the story hide the fact that we were actually learning how to survive? Music functioned in the exact same way. In 2008, archaeologists in the Hohlfels cave in Germany discovered a flute made from the bone of a griffon vulture, dating back at least 35,000 years. It was tuned to a pentatonic scale, the same five-note scale that forms the basis of much of modern blues and rock music. This means that if you could pull that ancient human into a modern recording studio, they would recognize the underlying structure of a Jimi Hendrix solo. The effort required to carve that flute, with its precisely spaced holes and smoothed edges, was enormous. It served no practical purpose. You can't eat a flute. You can't kill a cave bear with a flute. Yet, music is a universal human constant. Cognitive scientist Steven Pinker once called music auditory cheesecake, suggesting it's just a byproduct of other evolutionary traits, but many archaeologists disagree. They argue that music was a social technology, a way to synchronize the emotions of a group, making them more likely to cooperate and survive. But if music was a tool for unity, what happened when it was used for mass spectacle? The Romans took the Greek idea of fun and turned it into an industry of scale. While the Greeks focused on the individual athlete, the Romans focused on the crowd. Chariot racing at the Circus Maximus was the most popular sport in human history. The stadium could hold 250,000 people, roughly 1/4 of the entire population of Rome. To put that in perspective, the largest stadium in the world today, the Runggrado 1st of May Stadium in North Korea, holds less than half that many. Charioteers were the highest-paid athletes to ever live. A driver named Gaius Apuleius Diocles earned a fortune of 35,863,120 sesterces in the 2nd century CE, which, adjusted for inflation, would be worth over $15 billion today. This wasn't just fun, it was a societal obsession. Fans were split into the blues, greens, reds, and whites, and their loyalty was so fierce that it frequently erupted into citywide riots that could threaten the emperor's throne. Then, there were the Naumachia, the staged naval battles. These are perhaps the most unhinged examples of ancient entertainment. In 46 BC, Julius Caesar dug a massive lake near the Tiber River, filled it with water, and launched a fleet of real warships manned by thousands of prisoners who fought a literal battle to the death for the amusement of the Roman public. This wasn't CGI. This was real wood splintering and real men drowning in the sun. The logistics required to flood an arena like the Colosseum, as Emperor Titus supposedly did in 80 CE, are so complex that modern engineers still debate how they achieved the drainage. The Romans lived by the motto panem et circenses, bread and circuses. They understood that if the public was entertained, they wouldn't notice they were living under a military autocracy. Was the spectacle a way to satisfy a deep, dark hunger in the human psyche? But beneath the blood and the beer, there is a quieter, more touching side to ancient fun, the children. We have found dolls with movable limbs from ancient Babylon, terracotta tops from India, and miniature clay chariots from the Indus Valley. In ancient Greece, they had a toy called the yo-yo, made of wood or metal. One of the most heartwarming archaeological finds is a 3,000-year-old clay toy from the Hittite Empire in what is now Turkey, a small, four-legged animal on wheels with a hole in its nose for a string. It is, for all intents and purposes, the same toy you'd find at a preschool today. Children in the ancient world didn't have iPads, but they had the exact same capacity for imaginative play. They played house, they played war, and they played with pets. We have Roman epitaphs for pet dogs that are so heartbreaking they would make a modern cat person weep. One tombstone for a dog named Patricus reads, "My eyes were wet with tears, our little dog, when I bore thee to thy grave. Thou wouldst lick the cup with thy greedy tongue which my hand held out to thee." If children's play hasn't changed in 4 millennia, have we? This leads us to the big reveal, the single biggest insight into why ancient humans spent so much time on fun. Evolutionary biologists now believe that fun is not a luxury, but a biological imperative for brain plasticity. In a study published in the journal Behavioral Brain Research, Scientists looked at how play affects the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for social interaction and decision-making. They found that animals and humans that are deprived of play as infants grow up to be socially incompetent and unable to handle stress. Fun is a safe space where the brain can simulate dangerous situations, practice social bonds, and test new ideas without the risk of actual death. The hunter who painted the bull was simulating the hunt. The child with the clay chariot was simulating the race. The gambler with the knucklebone dice was simulating risk management. Fun is the laboratory of the human soul. But if play is a survival mechanism, why does it feel so unnecessary? The truth is that our ancestors were more like us than we care to admit, yet their relationship with fun was far more integrated into their survival. They didn't go to work and then come home to have fun. Their work, the hunt, the harvest, the building, was shot through with songs, stories, and rituals. They lived in a world where the line between the sacred and the silly was almost non-existent. A game of dice could be a way to talk to a god, and a religious festival was a way to get spectacularly drunk. They understood that the nasty, brutish, and short nature of life required a counterbalance. If you're going to live in a world that can kill you with a single bad winter, you need to be able to laugh. You need to be able to find the rhythm in a vulture's bone. You need to be able to look at a dark cave wall and see a stampede of horses. Why did they choose joy when the world gave them so many reasons to choose despair?